Important battles you should know. In 216 BC, the Second Punic War had already been raging between Rome and Carthage for 2 long years. The Roman consuls at the time, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, had spent those 2 years getting their butts physically handed to them by the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca. Having just been defeated at the battles of Trebia and Lake Trasimene, the Romans were feeling vulnerable. So they levied and fielded the largest land army of their entire history up to that point, consisting of over 86,000 men. This was 15,000 light infantry, 55,000 standard infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a 10,000 man allied garrison. Hannibal only commanded 50,000. He had 6,000 skirmishers, 2,000 slingmen, 32,000 infantry, and 10,000 cavalry. Hannibal had also just seized a supply depot in the Roman town of Cannae, and the Romans, under the control of Varro, sought to take those supplies back. Varro drew up his troops with his infantry arranged in a large block, flanked on either side by his cavalry. Hannibal arranged his infantry into a wedge formation with his cavalry on either side. Naturally, the Romans assumed that he meant to push through the Roman center to create a two-fronted battle. Given the Roman strength of numbers, they correctly assumed that this would not work. As the Romans and Carthaginians engaged, the Romans easily pushed the Carthaginian troops back, and the wedge began to invert. Though it looked as though the Romans were winning, they did not realize that they had just fallen into Hannibal's trap. Hannibal allowed the Romans to advance, using their weight against them as his infantry began to wrap itself around the Roman formations. Meanwhile, the cavalry began to engage, and the Roman flanks were forced to retreat. But at that moment, the Carthaginian cavalry returned, boxing them in from behind. Hannibal essentially allowed his infantry to create a bowl to contain the superior number of Romans, and his cavalry was the lid which shut over them to trap them inside. Even though the Romans were stronger, they had accidentally worked themselves into a complete envelopment, and from that position, Hannibal began the complete slaughter of the Roman infantry. For the next several hours, the Carthaginians squeezed tighter and tighter until finally, the Romans were no more. When all was said and done, Hannibal had lost 8,000 men, but the Romans had lost upwards of 80,000. The consul Paulus was also killed in the fighting, while the other consul, Varro, only managed to escape with 3,000 of his troops. The Senate declared a national day of mourning, and the Roman historians claimed that there was not a single person in Rome who was not either related to or acquainted with someone who had been killed in the battle. At this point in the war, the Romans had lost 1/5 of all of their military-aged male population. They lost one of their 2 consuls and 80 senators, all in this single battle. Forensic historians also estimate that 30,000 gallons of blood were spilled on that day. Between the loss of life and military resources, this is widely considered to be one of Rome's worst defeats in its entire history. But 15 years later, Hannibal was finally defeated, and Rome won the war.